CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. To learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Hi everybody, my name is Paul McGee. So I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people here today, in the room or online. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Kerry Martin. Dr. Kerry is a visual artist and researcher, and this year's recipient of the Horne Creative and Cultural Fellowship at the University of Canberra Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. Kerry's research explores how art can act as a platform or catalyst for the continuation of conversations about some of our country's most shameful social histories. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge country and pay my deep respect to Elders and First Nations people for their care of the country where I'm grateful to live, work and create, and for the ongoing art and storytelling that's so generously shared. And a very big thanks to CCCR for awarding me the Donald Horne Fellowship for 2025. It's a real joy to still be here at this university and not another one I could name. So the last time I was behind this lectern, I'd not long before installed my PhD exhibition at Belconnen Art Centre and was waiting for my examiners to apply their arcane art. Pleased to say it all worked out well, not without a few minor hiccups, which I can tell you about later. And I'm really happy to be back here talking to you today. And a big thanks to my supervisors, Jen Webb and Bethany Turner, for their incredible support then and ongoing. So this presentation will be in a couple of parts. So look back at my doctoral research. I just thanked you, Bethany. You missed it. At my doctoral research, including exhibition feedback, which I didn't have last time I was here. My latest Royal Commission focus, a much milder obsession this time, some patterns that have emerged across multiple inquiries, and finally, if we've got time, a little peek at the research rabbit hole I'm about to dive into next. So art and Royal Commissions might be considered a bit of an odd pairing, but it's a relationship I've been examining for the last 7 years or so. So when I began this year's project, I was coming off the back of a 4.5-year immersion into stories of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. That was my PhD project. Prior to that, several years reading and making work about elder abuse in the Aged Care Royal Commission, which resulted in my first solo exhibition, More Than Words. And before that, making work and writing about witnessing my mother's slide into dementia. That was my honours project at the ANU School of Art. So I clearly have a fondness for very heavy topics. And at the start of this year, it's fair to say I was seriously beginning to question my choices and wondering just how many people I'd offended in a previous life, or 3, or even just this one. So we're all familiar with the notion of a Royal Commission, the highest form of inquiry in Australia, thorny, hairy, horribly expensive, but very important investigations into issues of largely, but not always, social injustice. So I'm not an expert on Royal Commissions by any stretch, but I do become very familiar with the witness, with the content especially the witness testimony, because it's from these narratives that the art germinates. To date, I've made it my research focus to make art in an attempt to continue conversations begun with Royal Commissions, to create work that acknowledges the injustice, highlights it, responds to it, and this is the most important part, I think, that honours the stories told by victims, survivors, families and supporters. So the truth-telling evidence, the lived experience that has become so fundamental to more recent Royal Commissions. Because it takes enormous bravery to tell those stories. Huge courage to stand up in front of cameras where you're being recorded, in front of commissioners, legal representatives from the institutions that you're testifying against, the public, the media. And for those who don't testify publicly, even meeting with commissioners privately can be a very difficult process. Or to write a submission that exposes some of your deepest trauma. None of this is easy. From an artist researcher perspective, it's the undisputed publicness of the truth-telling, not all of which makes it to the public in its unmodified form, that make commissions of inquiry such important and rich sources of not just data, but inspiration and interest. And once we're in receipt of these stories, this truth-telling, it's our fundamental responsibility as researchers, and quite frankly, just as good humans, to treat these narratives respectfully, which is what I try very hard to have front of mind when I'm creating art or writing about it. So an inquiry finds out all sorts of stuff, makes any number of recommendations, usually in the hundreds. There's a bit of a flurry around the handing down of the report and then the government's response to it. And if there's a controversial witness, the media is there. George Pell comes to mind in my PhD topic. And then it all largely goes away, except of course for those people who are still living it. When I spoke to Commissioner Fitzgerald for my PhD, he was one of the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commissioners, he said that these injustices require constant vigilance, and more often than not that comes from advocacy, continued agitation, examination of and conversation about the issues. This is one of the reasons why I've done this work and why I think art has an important place in the pantheon of advocacy and protest, for want of a better description. So my doctoral research was grounded in victim and survivor testimony from the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse, 2012-2017. And my art practice was, and is still, guided by the use of a reparative aesthetic, examined and promoted by Professor Susan Best, an Australian academic and art historian. I think of this aesthetic as a gentle provocation, or as I sometimes like to call it, beauty with a bit of a bite. It involves creating work that sustains viewer attention on difficult subjects by moderating potential feelings of guilt or shame, while still revealing painful or disturbing truths. For me, it's about offering a contemplative space in an exhibition setting and or a mindset using the beauty of textile art, often embroidery, as a form of engagement with the subject matter and by extension the viewer, so that aesthetic pleasure and critical reflection can coexist. Despite its name, the reparative aesthetic doesn't aim to repair, to heal trauma, or to erase it. In my view, it's the amplification of victim and survivor voices that is most paramount to the aesthetic. So my interest lies in aligning beauty and a degree of technical skill with awareness of complex issues, so that lingering with the work deepens both emotional responses and cognitive understanding. I want audiences to appreciate the work, the art's aesthetic qualities. That's very important to me as an artist, and to engage thoughtfully with its implications, incredibly important from a researcher perspective. To stay with the work rather than turning away, even when the subject is deeply confronting. The wonderful now Professor Emerita Jen Webb, don't know if Jen's online, if she is, hi, was the first person to introduce me to Graham Greene's line from his autobiography, A Sort of Life. It said, "There's a splinter of ice in the heart of a writer." So the creative writers in this room will undoubtedly have a more nuanced reading of this than I do, but I understand it as Greene pointing to the need for a certain emotional distance in order to create. So this idea resonates, although not perfectly, with one of Susan Best's belief about the reparative aesthetic, where she argues that artists shouldn't be victims themselves, but instead act as secondary witnesses. So to be at a remove from the subject. I don't actually completely agree with that, but I think there's some wriggle room here. For me, it's not so much about emotional distance, but more of a kind of reasoned restraint. If a work is completely unconstrained because of rage or fury at the injustice, perfectly justifiable, but the sentiment or the message risks being obliterated or not fully appreciated. If it's both unconstrained and grotesque or ugly or just not beautiful, and I'm very aware that they're very subjective terms, and I do have an absolute bias towards beauty, if it takes on an anti-aesthetic tenor, it can actively drive people away as too confronting and prevent them from staying with the work long enough to consider the implications of it. And this is precisely where the reparative aesthetic proves powerful and why I'm drawn to it. It keeps people present, allowing them to attend to the complexities of the artwork and the subject matter. So, the idea that art is completed by the viewer is a widely accepted interpretation of Duchamp's quote seen here. His argument that a work of art isn't finished until it meets its audience. It's a truism, of course, that once a creative exposes their work publicly in any way, that it no longer belongs to the maker. This completion comes in viewer responses to the work, and we don't always know what they will be, might be, or indeed are. I hope that people are emotionally moved and cognitively engaged by the work I make, but whether they're moved to action or conversation, which is largely the aim, or simply personal reflection, which is still a very useful thing, is largely out of my control. But I have had glimpses into people's reactions and responses in the bodies of works I've made previously, all using a reparative aesthetic. So my dementia project connected me with people in similar positions, caring for a loved one with this horrible syndrome. Many wanted to talk about their own experiences, and almost everybody had a story to tell. In the aged care work, I received unsolicited messages from nurses working in this field, thanking me and telling me I'd rekindled their sense of purpose and resolve to stay in aged care. And wow, that was totally unexpected and a massive piece of feedback for me. I had many in-gallery conversations about the work and people's own histories during my PhD exhibition. They spoke openly with me about their own experiences and the stain of child sexual abuse. These are small but very powerful connections and impacts that art can foster. People open up when they see the bravery of other people's storytelling, not mine, the stories of victims and survivors. And because of the public nature of that through Royal Commissions, I'm able to use that in my art. But wanting to take a bit more of an analytical approach to feedback, most unusual for me, I invited visitors to my PhD exhibition to respond to the work. They were told that the feedback was voluntary and asked not to write anything that might identify them. Although lots of people I knew signed their names. I'm sure they just wanted me to know that they'd been to see the exhibition. Bless. So I ended up with 82 pieces of feedback in the offering pouch, and I used an offering pouch and not a like a notebook, because I wanted people's feedback to remain private, because I had a sense that some of it would be quite sensitive, and it was. I'd have to say my first foray into thematic analysis is ongoing, but I do have some initial thoughts. And of course, I'm most interested in how the feedback relates to my research questions, which were, so the PhD attempted to establish an argument for three key positions. that art can be a platform or conduit for continuing conversations around complex issues of social injustice, that the fusion of art and inquiry outcomes is a strong and effective combination, that textile art is a compelling medium to do that, given its rich storytelling history and our own familiarity with cloth and thread, that the use of beauty is a legitimate and fitting entry point into the genre of socio-political art. So what did the feedback say? Oh, that's what it said. Time to go to the next slide. So in relation to my primary research question, responses demonstrated a number of things, that people understood what I think of as the kind of the duality of the reparative aesthetic, that beauty and tenderness can coexist with an understanding of the content, which is, you know, very often brutal and about trauma. Many people connected the work to advocacy and justice and as a way to keep the issue in the spotlight and sustain conversations. There were many examples of visitors being moved by the work, by the affective nature of the reparative, describing it as powerful, moving, unforgettable, and very importantly, as acknowledging victim and survivor trauma. Using textile practice as a medium was also foregrounded in the responses. Viewers recognised the commitment in the work, reading the emotional labour as a gesture of care and witnessing. The juxtaposition of the delicacy of embroidery with the brutality of abuse created that dissonance that ensured both an affective and a cognitive response to the work. In relation to beauty, visitors acknowledged being drawn in by the visual appeal, affirming that beauty operated as a reasonable entry point. They talked about being captivated by the craftsmanship, but then finding themselves unexpectedly moved by the emotion and the meaning behind it. Even though the subject matter is heavy, people felt the way it was presented gave it some dignity and depth, that beauty helped hold the weight of the content. So overall, the installation was experienced as powerful, moving, and beautiful. I was really overwhelmed by the generosity of the feedback, not only the amount of feedback, but the incredible thought that went into it. But these were probably my favourites. Start them young, get them into the galleries young. I've got another very interesting young story later. So the feedback for me was overwhelmingly positive, and most importantly, pointed to the research questions kind of being, hitting the mark. There were only 1 or 2 negative comments, and I'll refer to one of those a little bit later. So this year's been an extension of my doctoral research through looking into and making art, some art, not a lot of art, about my another commission of inquiry, this time the Defence and Veterans Suicide Royal Commission. Now, I thought a lot about whether to include this next bit, took some advice. So I am going to take a brief detour here to present my credentials, and I use the term with tongue firmly in cheek. So I'm no stranger to the Defence Force. I have a family history, as I'm sure many of us do. So top left, great-grandfather, he will become very important later on. Next to him, my grandfather Lofty, he served in World War I and World War II. Served in World War II as a 40-something-year-old, was one of the rats of Tobruk. Next one, that's my dad on the far right of that picture. Served in New Guinea, caught dengue fever, almost died. I think that's great Uncle Bert, who of course I didn't know, World War I, but I just love the photo, so I'll put it in. Bottom left is my brother-in-law Blue, who served 2 tours of Vietnam in the Special Air Service Regiment. Totally loopy, say no more. Next is my sister, my late sister, who served in the army for 4 years. And bottom right, my ex-husband. We're very fond of each other. He sent me that photo yesterday. He was an infantry battalion commander and obviously served as a UN peacekeeper. So quite a big family history. And I joined the army when I was 17. Look at that cute face. straight out of school, and as I like to tell it, escaping my mother. I had one of those sliding door moments. Literally a train ticket to Sydney in one hand. I grew up in Newcastle, and my university acceptance papers in the other. They arrived the very morning in the letterbox the day I was catching the train to Sydney. So the universe being such a trickster and me being the incredible goody two-shoes I was back then, I got on the train because that's what I said I'd do. And it was only meant to be for 3 years. 11 years later, I resigned after having my daughter. And then after my second child, my son turned 3, I went back as a full-time Army reservist. Later, I joined the Department of Defence as a public servant and even spent a very brief stint in the Navy Reserve. That is me driving a submarine in Sydney Harbour. Such a day. That was the best day. Long story, great day. So about 18 years in defence in various guises. And along with my family history, that's part of what I think, again, lightly as my authority to take on this project, or at least to enter into it with a certain understanding of the culture and its issues. Now, none of that makes me unique, but revisiting that, perhaps driving the submarine does, I'm not sure about that. But part of my life this year caught me a bit off guard. As one veteran wrote in her submission, at 17 years old, I was still a child. Indeed, as was I. I didn't think it at the time. I thought I was, of course, incredibly mature. But people often ask me how I cope with reading and using traumatic stories as the basis for my work. And up until this inquiry, I'd managed well, even when the topics were close. You know, mum's dementia, aged care, where both my parents died, or the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commission, where the testimonies were harrowing. I think it's because my mind is occupied with the creative process, you know, turning the words into something visual, and I digest that material in small doses wherever I can. I also maintain distance because I'm not engaging directly with victims or survivors. But that statement there, that understanding that I was still legally a child when I joined the Army, actually hit me like a ton of bricks. It was deeply unsettling, even after all these years. And I've had some counselling, it's fine. But imagine what it's like for people who actually are victims and survivors. What it showed me was that despite decades since leaving the Army, yes, I am that old, I still hold an intimate understanding of that institution. And sadly, what the Royal Commission uncovered was all too familiar. As it found, there's been very little fundamental cultural change. All of that aside, what feels most important in my role as an artist researcher is something that's really been cemented for me this year. And I think it's, you know, it's akin to a core belief really, that since I ditched the real world and went to art school 10 years ago, I've always paid attention to the heart, I've always felt a responsibility to engage with difficult subjects in both my research and my art. And for me, those two things are pretty inseparable. And it's a personal choice, of course. There are times when I wish I could just make a whole pile of pretty inconsequential things, and sometimes I do for friends as gifts. But I also think artists across all creative fields have always paid attention to the hard stuff, to social histories, injustices, cruelties, and trauma. And as members of a community, I believe we have a responsibility to notice and to respond. I'm attracted to the words of Brazilian photographic artist Rosângela Reno, who said this: "We, meaning artists, reach people by doing very specific, subtle, and small aesthetic actions which are still extremely political." So I wouldn't call myself a political animal or an activist, not by any stretch, but that idea about subtle and small aesthetic actions sits right at the heart of the reparative aesthetic that I work with. So I'm only going to talk briefly about the Defence Royal Commission, because I've also been interested this year in the patterns across my interrogation of 3 Royal Commissions. Using this very ghastly graphic, it's awful, from the Commission, I didn't do it, from the Commission website, we can see some key things, timeline for the inquiry, the methods of information gathering, evidence collection, and some very sobering statistics. I was genuinely surprised by the extent, as Wadham and Cotter reported in the conversation after the final report was handed down. Over the course of I'm quoting here, over the course of the inquiry, the certified numbers of people who died from suicide rose from around 300 to around 1,700, thanks to a forensic focus on the statistics. Maths is not my thing, but that's, somewhere between 5 and 6 times the number originally identified at the start of the process. And that figure of 1,677 is 20 times more deaths than those killed in combat, where we would reasonably expect defence deaths to come from. And defence personnel are much more likely to take their own lives than the civilian cohort they're compared with. And of course, there are positive aspects to defence. I certainly had some incredible experiences, and some submissions noted these, but the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to 5 key contributing factors. Most common issue raised was around culture, governance, accountability, the internal systems that shape how defence operates. Mental illness was, of course, a major factor, but what's important is how that illness is often compounded by the very system that's meant to support people, especially through DVA's complex claims and compensation processes. Add to that ongoing problems with access to mental health support, within the organisation, and the enduring culture of bullying and harassment. And you start to see how these factors layer on top of each other, creating an environment that can be incredibly damaging, particularly for those who are already vulnerable. And of course, unfortunately, none of this is new. As with so many Royal Commissions, this is a pattern across Royal Commissions, defence has been scrutinised again and again. Around 50 previous inquiries and reviews, including of DVA. In fact, I worked on one of those myself, the government's efficiency review of DVA in 2016. It was a truly horrible experience. At the time, I was full-time at art school, and I was consulting during semester breaks and at night and in the morning trying to earn a living. Let's just say that the disconnect between art school and that review was the straw that broke the camel's back of my consulting career. It was awful. Across all of those inquiries, though, more than 750 recommendations in total, there's still been no sustained reduction in the rates of suicide over the past 2 decades. The commissioners didn't pull any punches when they put down their report. So they laid the blame firmly at the feet of successive governments, departments, and by implication, the leadership of those bodies. Actually, it was more than implication. They really belted the leadership of defence. So there are some key themes that emerged for me after examining 3 Royal Commissions. That they're most often established because of prolonged and vigorous advocacy by people who've been impacted, not by those with any form of authority, so not by institutional initiative, even after countless reviews. The critical importance of victim and survivor testimony about lived experience once commissions are established. Not only do they highlight the issues, but they can also influence the direction of an inquiry while it's in progress, and obviously help to make reasoned recommendations. Institutional failures and injustice created through institutional breakdowns in governance, culture, or leadership, and these things actually perpetuate the abuse. Again, nothing overly surprising there, unfortunately. There's a definite flavour in these reports that large organisations put institutional success, reputation, or profit, in the case of aged care, above the health and wellbeing of those in their care. This institutional abuse and a disregard for duty of care looks a bit like this. So the aged care system's continuing failure to protect. So this work, the chair and the pills, is a work I did for my aged care exhibition, and it's called Show Some Restraint. It was originally exhibited in 2022, but when I re-exhibited it in 2023, I added a taser, making reference to the tasering and subsequent death of 95-year-old Claire Rowland at an aged care home in Cooma. And there's a little interesting little story here. So I got a phone call from the gallery one morning saying, "Kerry, I'm really sorry. There's been a young boy came in with his mum, broke the taser. Can we please give you some money to make a new one?" So I hopped in the car, went down to the gallery, and I looked at it and I went, "You know what? I love that it's broken. I absolutely love that it's broken." So Duchamp had a point, didn't he? You know, art was definitely completed by the viewer in this case. And the red shoes here, and similarly, Karen, who helped me make these red Pope shoes for my PhD exhibition, before we put them into the kiln, I think as they were drying, it got a big crack in it. And I went, "You know what? Let's leave the crack. It also makes a point." So happy accidents. And then we have the church's continuing vigorous defence of perpetrators and the legal avenues used at great cost to restrict compensation to victims and survivors. Defence's enduring lack of sustained and strong leadership, ironic, right? To deal with and not just pay lip service to the issues confronting them, and a culture that feeds it. Flawed avenues for advocacy, the military justice system, and the Catholic Church's schemes for restitution. These processes have been shown to contribute to ongoing trauma and mental health issues for victims of these institutions. A wise friend, Ronnie, said to me ages ago, I pay attention, Ronnie, if all the inquiries, reports, inquests, investigations ad infinitum can't move people or systems to change, then what on earth can? I suggest to you, and I'm sure you know where this is going, that at least in part, and perhaps only a very small part, creative pursuits can. So the factors that most influence my art making are kind of the details of institutional abuse in the words of victims and survivors. That's the main thing. The evidence of organisational failures and the power of advocacy. Advocacy especially both maintains and resurrects conversations, and art can amplify that. At the Difficult Conversations Symposium here in 2022, I was on a panel talking about my research. And at one point during that, I made a disclaimer that I wasn't a Catholic and I wasn't a victim. So I wanted to be really, really clear about those things. And at the end of that session, a lovely man called Paul, not our Paul, you know Paul? Oh, yeah, Paul. He was a victim from Ballarat. He said to me, "Never apologise for being neither a survivor or a member of the church, because people want advocacy. We want you to stand alongside us. And there are people who cannot use their own voice, so other voices are welcome." And that guidance really sheeted home to me that my practice had meaning, and that most importantly for me, I wasn't seen as misappropriating other people's stories. So what did I make this year? I have to be really honest, and I'm very embarrassed to say the short answer is not a lot. I've done more thinking than making. I was very surprised at how tired I was once the euphoria of getting the floppy hat had left me, and how much 4 years of continuous making at the scale and complexity of my PhD output would actually affect me. However, there is something in the pipeline still going. And when I talk about the reparative aesthetic being beauty with a bite, a large part of that for me has been the subversion of symbols coupled with the use of testimony. So artifacts and text and objects and words. There are, of course, dangers in subverting symbols that are incredibly important markers of belonging to a particular group of people, and where there might be an emotional attachment to them. And defence is replete with these. Unit insignia, badges of rank, colours, banners, patches, uniforms, you name it, they've got it. So I had plenty to choose from. But because everyone seemed to love my giant rosary, as did I. Uh, very fond of that piece of work. I knew that I wanted to make something else large scale because I was pretty sure, in fact, I knew I wasn't going to make a whole body of work this year. The type of textile work I make being very, very slow. And as I said, I was really, really tired. So I wanted to go big. My first thought was to make a giant medal. I had some concerns about this because, medals are contentious, but it wasn't the contention that bothered me. It was more that using that symbol as representative was a bit problematic. Not everybody has a medal. And just as I didn't want to make specific reference to Pell in my PhD body of work, big distraction, nor did I want to draw attention to a certain VC recipient in this work by using a medal. And there's been some very recent talk about him lately, so I'm very happy with that decision. I'm always conscious that there's a chance that viewers might misinterpret my intent, might see the use of symbols as disrespectful, and make this the focus rather than the message. So in my PhD, where I did indeed do a lot of subversion of Catholic symbols, of the 82 pieces of written feedback I received, only one referred to this negatively, and it said, in part. Yep, you can criticise the church all you like, it's done some terrible things, but don't use symbols that are important to people. So, it can be very upsetting. But as I said, only one piece, but, I do take that seriously. But I was very wedded to the idea of something symbolic. So I ended up deciding I'd make a set of dog tags. Wilson just happens to be my maiden name. I didn't know that. And I am O positive, but they're not mine. There was a word that anchored my PhD work, and that word was shame. I wanted to shift shame from victims and survivors, where it so often resided, and transfer it to the church and to perpetrators. For this Royal Commission, betrayal is the word that anchors this work. It was spoken about in many submissions and testimonies. Dog tags are so emblematic of belonging to this organisation, but they also symbolise death and wounding, or if we want to relate that more specifically to this inquiry, suicide and suicide ideation. They're a visible identifier of belonging, and when that sense of belonging is removed or damaged, there's an absolute sense of being betrayed. It's something you just never do to your mates in this institution. So I still haven't completed it, but here's the concept and some of its parts. Another ghastly graphic, this time of my own making. So I started with these black crocheted balls. Smart ones of you will recognise they're the same ones from the giant rosary, because I was actually going to make 3 giant rosaries, but good sense and frozen shoulder for a year put paid to that. And I'm a big fan of black, as you may have also noticed, but so I was very taken aback when someone suggested that I paint the balls silver so that they'd look more like the chain that dog tags are attached to. Very literal, but I have no problem with that. So I did a test, and to my surprise and mild annoyance, I liked it, or at the very least, I didn't hate it. So I basically spray painted everything. You'll note the heavy use of text, and I brought some in if people want to have a look. You'll note the heavy use of text. I've always had a fascination with words, and my venture into visual art hasn't reduced that in any way. And having the same, the text, the same colour as the background is a bit of a signature device of mine. Used it quite a few times. I think it invites people closer to the work and keeps it with them longer, because in an exhibition context, you cannot read that from across, a gallery. So people have to come in close to actually read. I'm slightly concerned that I might have made this a little too difficult in this case, because it is quite hard to read. So for me, the truth as it's reported in commissions and taken as is fundamental to the art. And while there's a creative license in the mode of art making, there's no leeway for me when it comes to amplifying the voices of victims and survivors. by using their exact words. So this work is slightly different in that I've used words from both survivor testimony and the factual evidence that emerged from the Royal Commission. So I'm trying to here combine causation and impact. So, you know, things like moral injury, administrative violence, a toxic culture, secondary trauma, along with quotes like, he was abandoned, I was stuck in hell, I have a wounded soul. So some things about my approach have been cemented this year, and others I'm still questioning. It's reinforced my conviction that text is fundamental to my practice and to viewers' engagement. I've seen audiences read every piece of text in every exhibition where I've used that device, and that's pretty well been all of them. With my aged care work, there were 90 white handkerchiefs embroidered. They covered 3 walls of the gallery, and I watched people read every single one of them, which I was actually really surprised about. So words matter, and they draw audiences in. So in the PhD, I argued that exhibiting work after a Royal Commission helps keep its issues in the public eye, an act of ongoing advocacy, because despite the depth and recommendations of Royal Commissions, the problems rarely completely disappear. I still question the timing. Might art be more powerful if made during a commission, as a parallel form of commentary, perhaps? But my methods, slow, hand-embroidered, and deeply labour-intensive, don't allow for that immediacy. But on the flip side of that, the emotional labour inherent in my work holds meaning, and audiences seem to recognise and appreciate that well beyond the end of the inquiry. I guess, you know, social injustice doesn't have a time bound. So at its core, I think my work around Royal Commissions has always aimed to do one key thing: to keep the conversation going, to create a space where people can keep engaging with really difficult subjects through the actual words and experiences of those who live them, without reading countless volumes of a report. Because Royal Commissions bring those lived experiences to the forefront publicly, and they're never just one person's story, they echo many voices. Commissioner Fitzgerald said to me when I asked him if any of what I was doing would make a difference, said this: "Yep, it will. But you know, he obviously spoke to 1 million people, and this is, you know, part of his process. But, you know, it doesn't matter how many people you speak to in how many kind of different situations, it will make a difference to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. It always does. And, you know, the artist in me has to think that that's enough." So after this year and feeling more refreshed, I'm now looking at what else I might pursue in a research sense, while taking a step back from exhibition-sized art making. I'm going to be presenting at the Arts in Society conference in Athens in June, so that's very exciting. But more long-term, there's a project in the wings. So I showed you an image of my great-grandfather earlier, John Musgrove. He was killed in action in 1917 in Belgium. And I've had in my possession, since my mum died about 6 years ago, these postcards, 2 of them embroidered postcards. I originally thought that they were from my grandfather to my mother in World War II, but on closer inspection, pay attention to the detail, Kerry, a few months ago, I discovered that they were from my great-grandfather to my grandmother, Ivy, who I absolutely adored. So John, as I said, died in 1917, so these are over 100 years old. And when you read the back, you can't, terrible handwriting and atrocious spelling, but that's fine. But you can't help but be moved, I think, by the words and by the knowledge that he never actually made it home. So it got me thinking about postcards. And obviously I'm interested in these because of the family connection, but also because they're embroidered, which is what I do. What new rabbit hole could I go down? My first thought was that I could make contemporary versions of these very old postcards. For example, what would a modern version, perhaps from Afghanistan or Iraq, look like? And then out of this fascination with the embroidered postcards in particular, and someone, and I'm looking at you, Irfan, suggested to me that instead of focusing on trauma, I might try exploring tenderness. So here we go. Out of that has come an idea for a research project that Paul and I are taking on, happily keeping me here at UC, so I don't have to go off and learn how to play bridge or something equally ghastly. We're applying for a DVA grant called Saluting Their Service. Hopefully no one will remember that I reviewed them all those years ago. It was not complimentary. Along with Amy Johnson from CQU, who works with veterans' families. So we want to explore the deeply personal letters written by Australian servicemen and women to and from their families and loved ones, spanning operations from the Boer War to the present day. I never for a moment thought I would get back into this military stuff, but here we go. We'll be focusing on love letters. Love, of course, coming in many forms. So, you know, love to children, to partners, to parents, to friends, to siblings. So we'll look at the contents of those letters to try and understand what it is we write when we're in life-threatening situations. Are there consistent themes? Are the hopes, fears, humour, longing or grief of the letter writers consistent or wildly varied across time and location? Do the messages change according to the recipient? We'll also examine the evolving forms of communication, from the handwritten letters and embroidered postcards of earlier conflicts to the more contemporary and digital correspondence that happens now, such as emails and text. These are predominant today, but obviously much more difficult to publicly access. Is there a difference in the content, language, sense of immediacy or intimacy across different communication forms, particularly in the shift from analogue to digital? And importantly, for me especially, our aim is to also generate new visual artistic responses by engaging artists, defence and veteran artists preferably, to contribute works that respond to selected letters, works that would ideally reflect and amplify the writer's voice and the emotional content. I'll be very surprised if DVA give us this grant because it's very much out of their wheelhouse. They're more about repairing graves or putting up a monument, but we'll see. I think this is, you know, a really wonderful project. So in conclusion, art's a pretty powerful thing, I think, in research and in the wild. Conversations about the meaning in a body of work can change opinions, spur people to act, and create an environment of understanding and compassion that might not have been there previously. Art can educate, illuminate, persuade, and it can communicate complex issues in a compelling and understandable way. And in my case, using the logic of a reparative aesthetic, it can do it quietly, or as I like to think of it, as a whisper or a gentle nudge, not an aggressive shout. So I just want to finish with this. The artist Gerhard Richter's closing declaration in the catalogue for the 1982 exhibition Documenta 7 said this. He obviously said it in German, but my German is crap. So art is the highest form of hope, which seems like a very good place to finish. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Kerry. That was really, really fabulous and beautiful. I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. Alex.
Thanks, Kerry. That was really, really wonderful. I really appreciate what you do and your thoughtfulness and clarity. And I took some lovely quotes, so thanks. My question is how, of course, Indigenous artists are doing this, modern Indigenous artists are doing this so strongly. so much. What engagement have you had with Indigenous colleagues, First Nations artists? And I speak also as just having come back from Melbourne, where I saw the amazing exhibition, 65,000 Years of Australian Art at the Ian Potter, which was bloody brilliant, and was special room where they dealt with their history of their professors of anatomy, which was stunning. They had old objects, but also modern art dealing with that very strongly that you're talking about. So I'm wondering about your understandings and interactions with First Nations artists.
I'm very embarrassed to say not a lot, very little. And in fact, when
Not yet.
Not yet. I mean, you know, I would very much like to, and Wendy's probably a much better person to answer that question than me. But one of the things, so when I was deciding which Royal Commission to look at for my PhD, the child sexual abuse one, to be very honest, attracted me because of the rich textile traditions and, you know, working as a textile artist, that's why I chose that. What I really wanted to do was the Aboriginal deaths in custody. But I felt, just as I was very aware of not retelling other people's stories in this Royal Commission, I was very concerned about stepping over a line that I shouldn't step over. So very open to collaboration, would absolutely love that, but haven't had the opportunity to do it yet. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer to your question, but it's the truth. Yes, and of course, and actually one of the things I was thinking about with the project Paul and I are taking on is, you know, perhaps there will be, you know, a lot of Indigenous soldiers. I'd actually like to explore that as part of that project.
Yeah, I'd add to that fantastic presentation. Just two comments and maybe a response. I read something by Zizek yesterday, Slavoj Zizek, about, and he was re-quoting Wittgenstein's last comments. And it was something like, what can't be spoken should be written, was his and the written, I think, in the wider sense of shown.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. And I thought that was really interesting in relation to what you're saying.
Yeah, I wish I'd used that quote. That's a good one.
Yeah. Go. I can't get it quite right, but have a look at it. The other one was we were lucky enough to go to the Venice Biennale, and we saw Archie Moore's presentation. And what made me think of it was your description of all of these royal commissions. And I don't know whether you know it, but basically he's got an entire wall of family.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of this huge space, he's just got this island, this Black Sea, and on top of it is endless white paper, And I got to tell you, it was amazingly effective.
Yeah.
And it won the prize.
Yep.
It was stunning.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that work. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Also, Judy Watson's work. She did a beautiful textile work about incarcerated with people who died in custody, and these beautiful panels. I don't know if you saw it at the NGA, of, you know, what people were imprisoned for, how they died. You know, that's again that, you know, it's voices. It's voices, you know, expressed in a different form. Yeah.
Thank you.
Look, I want to make a quick comment. I couldn't help hearing you use the same verb twice in two different contexts, and that's the verb to stay. And at one point, it was about the reparative aesthetic being one that allows people to stay with this very difficult material, where an angrier treatment might cause a lot of people to turn off quickly. And the other usage was when you talked about the workers in aged care who said that your artwork helped them to be able to stay at work. And I just found that intriguing, that creating a space to dwell with in a gallery might allow people to dwell with something in their work.
Yeah.
Work in this sense of, you know, very difficult calling. So I don't know, I wonder if you had more thoughts on that.
Other than to say that I was completely astonished by that, because that's a huge impact, and you know, as I say, you never know what impact a piece of art is going to have on somebody. I think that exhibition, that was really huge, and it amplified so many voices, probably less so than my PhD work. And I think when you're, you know, it's that thing about repetition as well, you know, going up close to the work, reading every word, but then having that experience multiplied, in that case, by 90, you know, it really hits home a message. And I was very careful in that to make sure that the quotes, you know, were inclusive of, you know, as many kind of people who were impacted by aged care as possible. And I think that, you know, that's probably why that happens. So, you know, two things about the reparative aesthetic: get people to stick with the work by using something beautiful or tender, or the words. And I think people can't help but then think about things, and it may be, you know, like other things. Well, yeah, I'm gonna stay in aged care, or, you know, in the PhD, one of the pieces of feedback was, you know, you've made me think about this. I'm a Catholic. I never thought guilty before, but now I think guilty. You know, so, you know, some incredibly powerful, you know, things that people think about that's unanticipated, really, from my perspective.
Thank you, Kerry. I can't help but disclose that you used one of my quotes. I was a witness for the Aged Care Royal Commission as a senior nurse who was bullied and harassed for bringing up neglect in a nursing home, to the point I had to leave my profession after 40 years. And as a person whose words were up there, it's not, it's that it's there for a long time is really important. And it's there, it was important to me because, yes, I became part of a family, even though I've got the Royal Commission folders and I've read them and I can see where I'm quoted and stuff like that. It's really important for it not just to be on a book in a shelf, which is where they normally are. And so the idea of the hanky too, the tears that people would have cried, and I know I cried over many different types of abuse in that area. So yeah,
Thank you. And one of the things I love about Belco is that exhibitions are up for 6 weeks, so it does give people a lot of opportunity
revisit it
to see it. And the hankies, I actually put a call out on Facebook. Send me a hanky, because who has hankies? Lots of people have hankies that they don't use. I got hundreds of them. It was great.
Any other? Oh, Ronnie.
Uh-oh.
Well, one of the things that I was listening to you, and we've talked a lot, but one of the things I was listening to here, and I hadn't thought of beforehand, all the words, so many words. And when you were mentioning people are staying with your exhibition and they're staying a long time, one of the things that came to my mind was, do you think that the words are holding them as much or even more so than the beauty is holding them into a space? That would be the first half of what I'd ask. And then the second half I'd ask is, there are other people's words. Have you ever considered what you might do with your own words?
No.
In your work? That's the easy one. It's the first one that is something a bit more interesting there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think there's a textile artist, and I think her name's Sarah Impey, who's written a book about textile art using words. And she says something like, you know, when there are words, and if people can read, obviously, they will read them, because I think it's about inherent curiosity. You know, what does that say? You know, oh, and what does the next one say? And what does the next one say? So I'm not sure whether it's the words or the actual artifact, for want of a better word, that keeps people looking. I know in the PhD, there were some very intricate works that would keep people, because you want to notice the details, and people would come back and go,
The dragon.
I noticed that the first time. So I don't, who knows? I can't really answer the question. I would like to think it's equal. It's equal, but the words are always really important to me, as is the video. I want to make beautiful stuff. I don't want to make ugly stuff. Yeah. So,
Thank you, Kerry.
thank you.
I was just listening to that kind of question / statement, and I wondered about whether the use of kind of religious symbolism and iconography and kind of, created that sense of the aura around it, because people, when you enter a church, you automatically kind of enact certain behaviors, which is that kind of quiet and careful contemplation. So I wondered if it could also be that aspect as well. And
yeah, I think so. And I did make, I'm going to blow my own trumpet here, the install, and big thank you to the install team at Belconnen Art Centre. The install was very complex, but it was meant to mirror a cathedral or a church. So it had, the aisle that you walked up with all the suspended collars hanging, and I think people got that. And then, there was an altar, at the end, the rosary. So I do think that spaces, also, and as I said in here, I wanted it to be a quiet space. So even though there were some very colourful things in the exhibition, there was also a lot of pale colours, whites and gold. So that was deliberate, to try and create a sense of calm, I suppose. And I actually had a big argument, not a big argument. I had a discussion with the gallery, because I wanted places for people to sit, and so we compromised, and there was one bench sort of at the end, and people did sit a lot and think, which was really lovely. Yeah.
That is actually a very timely question, because next Friday we have David Willis coming to present on the Rothko Chapel, which is a kind of religious space, but the content is artwork. And it's going to be about moral complicity as well. So, cool. It's interesting. It's going to wrap up those themes. Yeah.
Hi, Kerry. Thank you for your presentation, and really love your artworks. So there are two comments more. So first is about you use the trick of this kind of virtual accessibility. So you use the same color with the background and your work. And I'm just thinking, because it's embroidered, okay. And so people, we can say it's like make some difficult for us to say from distance, but for people who could not really see clear, they can touch. I know it's like not common in a gallery, but it provides another chance for people with like different capacity. Yeah. And the other thing is you mentioned why you doing the things this way is to want to like keep people in the conversation or advocate in a gentle and tender way. That reminds me why nowadays a lot of people like turn back to news, or they avoid news, is because currently more like news are writing in a way like shocking or scaring way, not really like a neutral or like
gently. So I guess it's quite similar as what you say. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, I mean, two things. I totally encourage people to touch the art because, and I think I might have even said it in the catalogue that, you know, people were welcome to touch it. I can't remember. And particularly the Pope's robes where all people's names were. I wanted people to have that connection. So I'm absolutely not precious about that. And I think the texture of embroidery adds to that. And then I suppose in the context of, you know, these topics are horrible, you know, and newsworthy, and they do get reported on, you know, when things are happening. But they can be presented in a way that isn't brutal or confronting, so that people, I don't watch the news. I very rarely watch the news because of that. I will read about it, but I won't sort of watch it. So I do think this is, you know, an avenue for getting a message across, amplifying voices in that gentler, confrontational way. Yeah. But thank you.
Okay, another way of watching the news. Amazing. So we're going to finish up now. Please join me in thanking Kerry again.